I think that if you look at the evolution of global supply chain, you can see it as Manfred Steger characterized the football that was used in the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. This football that we what was used in the World Cup, was supplied by Adidas, a transnational corporation headquartered in Germany. And the balls were manufactured in China using latex rubber made in India and thermoplastic rubber produced in Taiwan. The plastics, in turn, were generated from petroleum imported from the Middle East and Norway and carried on mostly South Korean-built ships. So this characterization, ladies and gentlemen, depicts the centrality of global trade in the economic and sociocultural development growth of our world. Many countries, however, are re-evaluating global supply chains. Questions are being asked. How dependent should the world be on a few countries for critical supplies? Should countries not produce more of their own food and move towards alternative energy sources? Europe is certainly moving towards reducing its dependence on Russian energy and expects to be fully independent of Russian energy in 8 years or less. The issue for Europe is a matter of trust. They do not trust that Russia and other countries will not use energy as a weapon for war in the future. Sanctions have worsened global supply and therefore increased prices of energy and food. And developing and African countries in particular have borne the brunt of global supply chain disruptions as well as sanctions because the shock absorbers they have proven very thin to withstand the shocks. Similarly, the infusion of technology in the manufacturing of products such as household appliances, mobile phones, computers, and so on, depends on the global supply of semiconductor chips. The evolution of the global supply chains has resulted in the supply of semiconductor chips being concentrated in Taiwan and China. COVID-19 also exposed the world's vulnerability with the disruption in the supply of semiconductor chips. The continuing tensions between China and Taiwan is also making many countries start to think about reducing their dependence and vulnerability in this area. We are therefore beginning to see the emergence of supply chain nationalism. The question is, how sustainable is it? It is important that we do not forget the lessons of the Great Depression of the 1930s. One of the problems that we saw in the 1930s, the history tells us that as countries became more economically nationalistic, the worse the depression got. And therefore, it is very important that we do not forget that lesson. Global trade at the crossroads requires the world to start new conversations around sustainable and more inclusive growth and trade. We need to start laying the foundations for greater collaboration on trade diversification through standardization, as well as leveraging technology to break more barriers. In Africa, we have formed the African Continental Free Trade Area, the largest free trade area in the world, to enhance trade amongst African countries. Economic nationalism in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will be a defeatist way forward. You cannot open Africa for trade and at the same time close your individual doors. Africa needs more trade and more value addition for its exports. Policymakers in these difficult times must strengthen macroeconomic policy buffers and institutions to promote stability. There is also the need to strengthen social protection frameworks to protect the vulnerable for a more just and equal recovery. As globalists, ours is a more connected world working towards shared prosperity. We owe it to ourselves and posterity to keep breaking barriers to ensure that the gap between the developed and emerging markets are continuously bridged for the good of us all. The time is right for conversations around transitions to a green economy and leveraging on technology to overcome disruptions in the global supply chain ecosystems. Ladies and gentlemen, democracy, rule of law, respect for territorial integrity of countries is what will create the peace and global stability for trade to flourish. The current supply chain and global trade disruptions is linked more to disruptions to democracy, rule of law, and lack of respect for territorial integrity of countries. Jihadist terrorism in the Sahel, for example, is a major threat to global trade and is creating instability in countries such as Chad, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Nigeria, and the West Africa region as a whole. The Islamic jihadists have no respect for the territorial integrity of countries they seek to take over. It is important that the world does not turn a blind eye to what is happening in the Sahel. Otherwise, we would wake up one day and find these countries, which supply most of the world's cocoa, as well as gold and many other precious minerals, and has such a large amount of fertile land and water, will be under the control of jihadist terrorists. The disruption to global trade and supply chains in this context will be very serious. And making sure these countries have peace and are stable and prospering democracies is what the world should do. Democracy is worth fighting for to preserve our prosperity in the world.